One envelope was small, the corners chewed by a child who had been in a hurry. The other was folded so tightly it had left a crease like a scar. They sat together on a walnut desk that had seen a dozen boardroom wars, beneath a brass nameplate. One was drawn with stars and purple crayon, and the clumsy looping the way 7-year-olds made their letters. The other looked like a confession scrawled between shifts, ink smudged by a thumb, the handwriting raw with fatigue, the words hurried, as if written at midnight so the writer could sleep again. Daniel Thornton picked them up with the same careful, almost embarrassed curiosity with which he inspected an engineer's draft that had gone slightly wrong. He had been mid-presentation, slides behind him, the executive team waiting for him to stitch numbers into destiny, when someone's assistant told him there were 2 letters from the company's holiday mailbox that he should read. The room hummed like a hive. He felt the noise, but not the meaning of it. The letters felt like a private thing, a small breach into his world. The crayon letters said, in a child's blocky script, "Please, Santa, get my mommy a husband. Love, Emma." There was a drawing of 3 stick figures on a hill with a sun that had teeth. The midnight letter said, in a different hand, "Dear Santa, I can't finish this without admitting I am tired of pretending. If someone could make us laugh again, if someone could help me believe it's okay to move on. Not for me to be fixed, but to be seen. I don't know if Santa answers grown-up letters. I only know my daughter asked, and I promised her I'd try." Daniel read them once, then twice. He felt, in a place that had long since stopped surprising him, a quiet unsettling, like a beam that had shifted in the foundation. The numbers he had spent his life measuring, risk, profit, tolerance, had never accounted for the weight of a child's plea or a parent's midnight honesty. His thumb rubbed the crease of the adult letter. He did not know who Sarah Mitchell was. He did not know the face attached to the hand that had written that note. But grief he knew intimately, the dull ache of a man who had once planned a lifetime beside someone else, and then had to learn the grammar of solitude. In a way that surprised him, he wanted to answer. He left the boardroom a man with the outline of a plan that had no logic in any spreadsheet. He took the elevator down past polished metal and glossy framed awards and out into the city that looked like a postcard for people who paid for them. He called Marcus Hayes on the way, not to tell him precisely what he was thinking. He had spent enough of his life practicing discretion, but to feel the sound of a friend's voice steady him. "You okay?" Marcus said, voice low enough for the hum of traffic to not steal it. "Curious," Daniel admitted. "We had 2 letters, one from a kid, one from a woman. I want to meet them."
"You mean—" Marcus caught the implication before Daniel finished the sentence. "No, not the company's charity event. I mean meet, as someone else." Daniel heard his own sentence and hated the flinch of shame that followed. "I don't want the letters to be tokens. I don't want sympathy. I want to know the person who wrote that midnight note." "Are you about to stalk a single mother because of a letter?" Marcus asked, but not unkindly. "Dan." "It's not stalking." Daniel's voice held a brittle clarity. "It's a curiosity and maybe something else. I used to believe in things I don't make charts for. I want to see if I can. If it's wrong, I'll stop." "Careful," Marcus said. "You pull one string in that web and it all comes down. You remember what happened last time you thought you could fix the wiring yourself." Daniel smiled despite himself. Marcus always remembered the times he had been reckless, but he also knew that Marcus would never let him go alone. "If I'm wrong, you'll tell me." "I'll tell you," Marcus promised, "and I'll go with you when you need someone to be grown and stern at the same time." He walked into the cold air and, for the first time in months, left his car at the valet. He wanted the city to feel less like territory and more like a place he could get lost in. He wore a coat that cost more than the diner booth he'd grown up eating in, but to anyone watching, he might as well have been a man with grease under his nails. He would be Dan Miller for a while. Mechanic, plain-spoken, nothing on his chest that glittered. It felt like a small experiment in humility. Sarah Mitchell had folded her letter and put it in the charity box with a hope that felt stubbornly practical rather than the stuff of movies. One more thing done, one more box checked. She had no illusions about miracles. She had been awake at 3 a.m. with a small body curled at her side and the sound of a radiator she could not afford to replace, and in that hour the letter had come out of her because the words needed a place to sit. Her daughter had seen her doing it and asked if Santa really answered grown-up letters. Sarah had smiled because lying by omission felt like a betrayal to a child who already had enough losses she couldn't name. The diner where she took Emma every Saturday morning belonged to Madison, a woman with a laugh that was equal parts sternness and warmth, who kept eggs perfectly fried and coffee hot enough to mend impatience. The booths had vinyl scarred with stories, the sugar dispensers never quite clean, and a bulletin board full of handwritten notices: piano lessons, lost cats, help wanted. That bulletin board had been the medium that weeks later would send Sarah's letter up to the Thornton Foundation's holiday pile. Madison had folded it into a stack of others and sent them off with a handwritten note. That small kindness was not meant to be dramatic. It was what neighbors did when they carried one another through small winters.
Emma was all knees and earnest conversation. She had a way of clarifying things that made grown people uncomfortable. "Mom," she said, syrup-dropped and earnest, "Santa is busy, but he will listen to grown-up letters if you ask him. You wrote for laughing again. I don't know why Mom stopped laughing, but I don't like it." Sarah handed her the crayon and watched as the little girl drew circles, each one perfect in its imperfection. It was the sort of scene that had, once, ensured Sarah's heart could unclench. She had been a nursing student before bills and grief and the slow bureaucratic grind of life had rerouted her hours. She had set aside her books, not out of surrender, but because the world demanded other things then: a regular check, a steady bedtime, a softness in ways that required more grit than glamour. When Dan Miller walked in, he carried none of the obvious markers of the life he left downstairs. He ordered coffee, black, and sat at the counter where he could watch the room like a man who had memorized the light in the windows. He noticed the smear of crayon on Emma's fingers, the careful way Sarah checked her phone for messages and then put it face down because she didn't want to be distracted from her daughter. He noticed how Sarah tucked the chair in a little more firmly than was necessary when she paid attention to the people around her, as though she were making small structural repairs to the room to keep it from wobbling. He left a tip like a small scandal, more than the order warranted. Madison raised an eyebrow and grinned. Sarah, who had seen hundreds of small kindnesses and hundreds of small humiliations, paid little attention until the man at the counter put his cup down and, with the practiced awkwardness of someone trying not to be conspicuous, asked if the seat next to her was taken. "No," Sarah said, "but my daughter will think you stole it if you try to occupy her lap." Emma looked up with the absolute seriousness only children possess. "Do you work for Santa?" she asked. "No," he said, and the corner of his mouth tightened. "Not professionally. I fix things. Sometimes that means I tinker with engines. Sometimes it means I help people fix their days." The truth of that sentence, that he had built things large enough to take the skyline and small enough to screw in a shelf, made Sarah study him. There was something familiar and cautious in his eyes. He spoke in measured sentences, not to impress, but so as not to divulge too much. For Sarah, who had learned to guard her small vulnerabilities like a mother bird guarding a nest, this was almost a relief. They talked about ordinary things: the city, the way the winter light made the streets look like brushed metal, Emma's favorite cartoons. Daniel asked about her work, and Sarah talked about night classes she dreamed of resuming, a part of herself she carefully stored in the back of a messy closet, between unpaid bills in the laundry basket. He listened in a way that made her small disclosures feel not like confessions but like offerings. He had the rare skill of making someone feel like they were the only person being attended to in the world. Emma, for her part, decided Daniel was an improvement on most people. She tested him with the things children can never resist. "Can you do a trick?" she demanded after pancakes. He performed a small trick with a napkin and a coin, a simple sleight of hand, a magician's patter learned from an uncle, and Emma clapped as if the world had become brighter. In that little applause, Daniel felt something loosen that had been tight for too long. It was not a cure, it was a crack where sunlight could fall. "What's your name?" Sarah finally asked. "Dan Miller," he said. "I fix cars." He could have said more and chosen not to. He had rehearsed the lines in his head on the drive over. Plain name, ordinary job, the kind of identity that would lower the stakes. He did not want to see the way her eyes widened when she might discover he could have paid off her debts 10 times over. He wanted an honest conversation, one unmediated by whatever wealth or influence his last name might invite. It was cowardice and courage wrapped in the same package. That afternoon, the three of them walked through a neighborhood park with a small frozen pond. Dan maneuvered Emma on a cheap rented skater's hand. She shrieked with the kind of uncalculated delight that fixes things. He lifted her, steadying her wobble the way he used to steady plans that had a tendency to collapse. It felt natural, like the old alignment of beams under a familiar roof. Sarah watched him with a guarded softness that had been honed by loss into armor that still let light through. Weeks in life are not epic poems. They are accumulations of minutes.
Yet in the few weeks after the diner, minutes stacked into something that felt like a pattern. Coffee at 9, playground at 3, sometimes a movie on a couch that had been patched and loved into a strange domestic splendor. There were small rituals. He left his watch at the counter when Emma painted with it, and his hands, calloused at the fingertips from years of drafting, would get smudges of glitter and syrup. Sarah noticed him early on when he bent to tie Emma's shoelace the way he bent to understand the problem at hand. It was a tenderness that could be mistaken for competence, but it was also more than that. Daniel had a way of seeing things that required attention and then making sure they stayed intact. Daniel did not become anyone's savior. He did not solve Sarah's money problems with a check. He offered once to help with a leaking pipe, and instead of writing a check, he took an afternoon, climbed into a crawl space, and reworked the joints himself. His engineering background, years in design and oversight, meant he knew how to hold a load without shouting about it.
He fixed the pipe the way someone who had once loved the rhythms of building fixed things, methodically, with respect for the structure that had been neglected. Sarah noticed the repair more than the offer of money. "You didn't have to do that," she told him when he came back up, grease under his fingernails, sleeves pushed to his elbow. "No," he said, "but I like to do things that make a difference without announcing myself. It's quieter that way." She believed him, partly because the thing he did could be seen and appreciated, and partly because he did not ask anything in return. That was important to her. She told him about her nursing classes in fragments, the textbooks she rented in paperback, the nights she lay awake thinking about a human body the way an engineer thinks about a bridge, a system of parts that ask for careful tending. He listened as if each paragraph of her life was a beam he could take responsibility for. The first date, when it came, felt like a test and a holiday rolled together. He took her to a modest bistro where people laughed without checking their phones, where the lighting favored honest faces. They ordered things neither had the habit of choosing, an appetizer to share, a wine that was neither cheap nor ornate. Conversation flowed because there was trust, low risk, high return. He told her about being a structural engineer before he had to choose corporate leadership, about a wife whose name was Jennifer and who had been killed in an accident that pivoted his life into the shape it had now. He watched her face as she held that level of admission, the way someone listens to a quiet confession that requires no advice, only witness. When he told her he had a son, Owen, she listened with a tenderness that widened the space in the room. The name dropped into the bistro like a small bell. Owen was 7, shy, a child who made jokes inside his own head. Daniel's grief had not disappeared. It had been redistributed. Some of it poured into work, some kept in the house like delicate pottery. He had built barricades and schedules rather than allow his sorrow to be random. He had learned to smile in ways that made sense to a son. Her admission about Thomas, her husband, came in a quieter voice, in a way that asked less of him. He did not flinch. He had wanted for a long time a person who could tell their own story in full without fearing pity. He did not offer trite consolation. When Sarah reached for his hand, it was in a way that said, "I am not finished, but I am not alone." That early tenderness, walking home holding hands like two people who had found a pebble of warmth in winter, was not uncomplicated. There were small moments of fear and awkwardness. Daniel lied by omission because he wanted to be known first as a person who could make Emma laugh, not as a man who could change the course of Sarah's debts. He was not thinking of trickery. He was thinking of being weighed honestly, without the ballast of a bank account. He feared people who loved him for the wrong reasons, for the aura his name carried. He told himself repeatedly that the lie was temporary. "I'll tell her when it's time," he said to Marcus one evening in the bar that smelled of old wood and newer whiskey. "I don't want to freak her out." "People deserve the truth," Marcus responded, "especially the ones you care about." "I know." Daniel's hands tightened around the glass. He did not finish, because there was no sentence he could make that would not sound like an excuse. Meanwhile, Sarah moved through her days like a woman practicing resilience. She collected small victories, an A on a midterm, a good report from her supervisor when the clinic was flooded with patients, a note Emma drew that said, "I love my mom, you smile good." She managed the household and coaxed her daughter toward doing arithmetic with the patience that had been reinforced by 2 years of hard nights. She was proud in the private way of a person who had chosen to show up, even when the world was not particularly kind. On a snowy Saturday, the family, if the word could be used so early, met at a children's holiday craft fair, where Owen, who had been shy in the first weeks, watched Emma take to him the way a light finds a shadow. Dan, still Dan Miller in Sarah's world, bought Owen a wooden toy truck at a vendor stand, and with a clumsy flourish, pretended he had made it himself. Owen looked at him with the sort of gratitude that put Daniel off balance in the gentlest possible way. The weekends were not everything. There were text messages he did not answer because the board expected him to be available, and there were nights when he returned to a penthouse with views that made him feel like an outsider in his own life. He kept 2 sets of keys, one for the downtown studio he used for work when the light was right, and the other for a faded sedan that smelled slightly of engine oil and old coffee. In the sedan, he made calls that sounded less rehearsed. He was more Daniel than Daniel Thornton behind the wheel. He learned slowly to let the ordinary parts of himself breathe outside the constraints of a role. He also learned to be careful. There were moments when his chest tightened because he knew that when the truth surfaced, it would be an earthquake. He could imagine the shock for Sarah, the discovery that the man who had folded her laundry and listened to her talk about grades was also the man who signaled quarterly results in numbers too big to comprehend. He imagined the humiliation Sue would feel at the thought of being seen as a charity case, or worse, a convenience. Victoria Ashford's name hovered in the periphery like a weather system. She was someone who had known Daniel since before the accident that rearranged his life, a friend of the family and a woman with opinions as sharp as a file.
Victoria navigated the city's social currents the way a seasoned captain navigated a narrow channel, precise, a little ruthless when it served the goals she kept close to the chest. She and Daniel had history, years of shared causes, boardroom dinners, a familiarity that made people assume more than was true. She liked order and function, and people who conformed to her idea of how public life should work. When Daniel started to choose his time differently, saying no to certain dinners, being less performative at charity galas, Victoria noticed. She called him privately with a tone polished for concern. "You're retreating," she said. "Don't do that. We need you in front. Don't let personal stuff derail what you've rebuilt." He did not tell her about the letters or the diner. He told her he was tired, and that sometimes tiredness was the best teacher. Victoria's response was a measured thing. She understood, but she was worried about optics. That worried Daniel in ways he did not expect, because he began to see that the life he had built was not only his own. It sat on other people's expectations, on investments, on the idea of stewardship. It was a bridge with many fingers pulling, and he was not sure he could maintain it if he let his own heart govern everything. Still, he kept going back to Sarah and to Emma, and to the way Owen's small jokes made him laugh. There were mornings when he would wake up with grease still under his nails from some small task, and the memory of Emma's laugh would carry him through a day of meetings where people discussed numbers and margins the way a cardiologist might discuss pulses. He started to see the cracks not as failings, but as invitations to repair. Marcus was both warning and salve. He called the arrangement irresponsible and somehow beautiful. "You're a fool," Marcus said once, laughing. "But if anyone can make a good mess, it's you." "Be gentler," Daniel replied. "I don't want to hurt anyone." "You might," Marcus said, "but you'll try to be honest about it. Promise me." "I promise," Daniel said, and meant it in the way a man makes promises between friends, with heavy sincerity. For Sarah, the developing relationship felt precarious and necessary. She guarded her heart like a mother guards an open flame, close enough to be warmed, but careful to keep it from burning. The possibility of being unmoored again frightened her, and still she let moments of trust become the scaffolding for something new. She allowed herself small pleasures, a new scarf, taking an extra moment to breathe on the subway, a text from Dan that said, "Are you both okay?" sometimes with a smiley face. Those messages were low stakes and human, and she liked them. One afternoon, while they were walking through a market, a reporter's camera caught them by chance, 2 people in a crowd, and snapped a photo that, in an ordinary world, would have been nothing.
That photo ended up, days later, on a tag on someone's social feed, accompanied by nothing more than an observation about the new man at the neighborhood diner. The ripple was small, but it made Daniel's shoulders harden. He told Sarah honestly that he sometimes worried about being recognized, and he reassured her that he had no plans to use his name as leverage. She said she believed him, because for now she did. She also made it clear that she would not be the subject of anyone's narrative without consent. It was not a perfect arrangement. There were closeted hours when he sat at his dining table in the penthouse and felt the enormity of the life he had built loom like scaffolding. There were nights when he had to be the CEO, and others when he wanted only to be someone who could make a small girl giggle. The duality wound through his days. It was both thrilling and corrosive. Then one evening he received an email that felt like a small flare in the dark. The Harbor Project, one of the company's newer developments, a sweeping waterfront complex that had been both praised and criticized, had a report attached flagged urgent. There were preliminary signs of a load-bearing miscalculation in a recently installed support beam. The project was scheduled to open in weeks. A failure could mean catastrophic collapse. Even a small error could end lives and careers. Daniel read it standing in the kitchen of his penthouse, the city lights making geometric constellations on the walls. A structural engineer by training, he ran the possibilities in his mind the way he used to run numbers. The temptation to delegate was enormous. He could send teams, call consultants, make decisions in sterile boardrooms with charts and contingency funds. Yet the very thing that made him good at this, the desire to be intimately responsible for the safety of a structure, begged him, almost like a moral imperative, to go down into the field. If he intervened hands-on, if he showed up in a hard hat and took a hammer in his own hands, the chances that someone would notice the face behind the name increased exponentially. It could also mean that he would be present for what might become a disaster, and because he was not just any man but a public figure, his presence would be a headline. He thought immediately of Sarah, a private life he had been coaxing into being, and he imagined the coverage in terms that made his stomach turn. He told Marcus about the report at midnight over a phone line that hummed with fatigue. "We should send a team," Marcus advised. "You don't need to." "Yes," Daniel said, "but I can't not go. It's our work. It's people's safety." Marcus paused. "You know what that will do." "I know." "It might blow everything up for you," Marcus said, "but you'd rather be ashamed for trying than for not having tried. When you had built your life on understanding the loads that people would place on beams and bridges, inaction felt like negligence."
He booked a flight early and drove to the site, ignoring the penthouse that waited like a silent friend. For hours he stood among men and machines, boots muddy, breath clouding in the cold, and read the problem like someone reading a body that needed triage. He listened to workers, examined bolts and welds with the concentration of a man whose past life of blueprints had taught him to watch for the tiny misalignments that presaged failure. It was not theatrical. He was not a hero performing on a stage. He was a man applying knowledge to avoid calamity. He directed efforts with a calm that came from long practice. He climbed where it was necessary. He put his hand to a beam and felt the vibration that spelled the difference between a structure that would hold and one that would fail. He worked until his fingers were numb and his throat was sore from shouting over the wind. By the end of the day, he had reorganized a plan, set temporary shoring, and written a list of urgent repairs. He did not know at the time that a camera drone had been overhead taking footage for a morning segment about the city's holiday readiness. He did not know that a news crew had followed a rumor of emergency response to the site. He only knew that he had done the things that must be done when a structure whispered of danger. He went home smelling of dust, his clothes smeared with plaster, and for a moment felt the tired satisfaction of a job done rightly. The next morning, the headlines formed like wavelets that would not be ignored. A still from that drone footage appeared in the city's morning feed. A man in a hard hat, directing workers, phone pressed to his ear. The caption identified him by name. Sarah, unwinding pancakes at the diner, looked up at a television over Madison's counter and saw the face she knew intimately, and the name she did not. She felt something inside her unspool in a way that made her want to bolt from the booth and run to the man who had told her his name was Dan Miller. When she saw the story, Daniel Thornton leading a rescue or shoring operation at the harbor project, her stomach turned into a small animal frantically searching for a hole. She read the story in a loop that left gamps and punctures. Betrayal, the first raw note, rose like a tide. He had told her he fixed cars. He had told her he was Dan Miller. He had never told her that his last name sat on plaques, that his signature wrote checks that steered futures, that his voice could be a public instrument. The discovery felt public and private at the same time, the two confluent like rivers meeting and producing something new and dangerous. He had been trying to be seen for himself, unfettered by wealth. The world had other plans. There was no melodrama in Sarah's reaction. There was a steady, clean betrayal. She felt used. The letters, the crayon plea, and the midnight note felt suddenly like the hinge on which her life had turned and found itself misaligned.
The trust she had started to build wobbled. She felt anger, and then grief, and then a resolute clarity that she did not want to be another person's experiment. Daniel, at the same time, did not anticipate a betrayal so precise in its ache. He had feared the moment of revelation like a man knowingly walking into a storm without an umbrella. Now, when the storm arrived as a headline and a chorus of social commentary, he felt the weight of his choice in a place that had been painlessness, his chest. He called Sarah before she could call him, because there are certain things that must be attempted, even when you expect them to fail. His voice over the line was thin with an apology that had not yet learned to be adequate. "I wanted," he began. "To be honest," she finished. Her voice was even, but there were sharp edges to it. "You had the chance, Dan. You used our life as an experiment." "It wasn't that. His words fell away, because no rationalization now would make much difference. I didn't want the money to do for me what it does for some people. I wanted to be known. Then be known, she said, not by what you let us think you are. Be known by the truth. He heard the finality in her voice. It was not an ultimatum as much as a boundary being set, like a wall reaching up, firm, clear, and necessary. When he arrived at the diner that evening, after the story had been gossiped about and polished like a jewel by people who loved the glint more than the meaning, she had already closed the booth. The light inside was softer than the light in the headlines. Emma clutched a scrap of paper she had drawn herself, a drawing of 3 stick figures with a son whose teeth had lost their edges. She did not look at Dan when he came in. Owen, who had been with Daniel that weekend and had heard the muffled way adults argued about exposure and identity, sat half under the counter as if that position could make reality less complicated. Sarah met him at the doorway. There was no dramatic scene, no pushing, no tearful pleas. She told him, without much preamble, that she needed time, that the lie had a cost, that she had told him things in trust, and those things deserved to be met with at least as much openness. She said, too, that she would not be the subject of jokes or whispers about the man who had been known by his wealth. She wanted the dignity of being a person chosen for the person she was, not for proximity to money. Daniel wanted to say that he had tried to honor that dignity, that he had tried not to be a man who used his resources to buy affection. He wanted to say that his choice had been born from fear of being loved for a ledger and not a lifetime. But none of that erased the fact that he had made a choice that had consequences. The apology he offered was real and imperfect. Marcus arrived at the diner like a buffer. He had come because he thought friends should be present when things got hard.
He did not argue for Daniel. He only tried to provide context, to explain shortcomings and the complexity behind the headlines. Victoria called too, though Daniel did not answer. Her message was a mixture of worry for the company's image and a clipped, almost clinical, suggestion that Daniel handle the matter in a way that preserved the brand. Sarah asked him to step back. "No contact for a while," she said. "We need what is ours to be private. I will contact you when I can make sense of this." He agreed because he had to. He left the diner with the hollow feeling of a man who had taken a sledgehammer to a bridge he had been asked to cross. The 2 letters, once the gentle and earnest catalysts of his curiosity, seemed fragile and foolish, like paper boats on a stormed river. He had wanted to build something lasting. Instead, he had revealed that part of him required secrecy to feel safe. And yet, underneath the hurt, something else simmered, an understanding that truth was messy, and that repair required more than a single conversation. He had, in truth, believed that he could meet her as Dan Miller, and then graduate into all that he was without causing ruin. It had not worked that way. He had not accounted for the dignity of the revealed person, or the anger that comes when someone else's world is used as an experiment. As winter wrapped the city more tightly, the new problem at the harbor project pulsed like an urgent light on his phone. He was part of a board that had obligations beyond his heart. The whispers about his identity were already shaping the narrative, and the possibility of a public scandal that could blame his decisions, not to mention the moral responsibility to ensure the safety of the project, now demanded his immediate attention. He understood with an engineer's clear-sightedness that this was a load he could not avoid by stepping away, and that being absent could cost people their lives. He did not know how to pull both pieces, his responsibility to strangers and his responsibility to the woman he had come to care for, without causing either harm. He thought of the letters, the childish drawing of stick figures, and the scratchy midnight plea about laughter. He thought of the tiny human things that had led him into this impossible geometry, the sound of a child's giggle, the smell of coffee at a diner, the small, steady work of 2 people building something they did not yet have words for. He drove to the site again, not because he wanted to become a spectacle, but because he could not be present for the people who would stand on what he had engineered. He felt, as he stepped out of the car, the weight of the moment pressing in from all directions, the heavy responsibility for public safety, the private obligation to a woman who had asked for honesty, and the knowledge that once he took certain steps, the world would know him in ways that could not be reconstituted.
Before he put on the hard hat, he took a breath and reached into his coat pocket.
He had folded the midnight letter once and then twice until it lived in the quiet place next to his wallet. He smoothed it with his thumb, the way a man might smooth a bruise he could not see, and thought of the strange alchemy that had turned 2 sheets of paper into the axis of a life. The letters had been the inlet for a story he had not expected to tell. He did not yet know the shape of the fallout. He only knew there was no going back to the feigned ordinariness of Dan Miller without consequence. The truth, once it began to move, had a velocity of its own. If the city teaches you anything, it is how quickly a private thing can become public. The drone footage that had first captured Daniel's hands on a bolt did not stop at a careful still. It found a moment later in which a piece of temporary shoring shifted under the weight of a wall, and one of the site foremen went down with it. For a few breathless seconds, everything at the project moved in the cadenced, terrible tempo of a thing about to fail. Daniel did not think of image or consequence then. He thought in increments, where the load was highest, which workers were unaccounted for, how many seconds they had before a ripple of collapse widened. He moved with that practiced authority that comes from having read the language of structures until it is under your skin. He signaled a team, found a strap, ordered hands and ropes, and when the foreman was pinned by a beam, Daniel crawled under the metal like someone whose body remembered how to make a place hold. He helped lever the beam with a jack, felt the give of metal and sweat, and then hauled the man out by the shoulder into a coughing slush of dust in alarm. The camera caught all of it, the hard hat, the grime on his face, the way he steadied the foreman and spoke to him in clipped, immediate sentences. The caption below the clip named him Daniel Thornton, and the clip spread with the velocity of a small, moral contagion. People shared it because the image tapped something that looked like courage. Others shared it because the drama was easy to judge. Sarah watched it at the diner while the television above the counter repeated the footage in a loop. She watched not for the heroism but for the quiet shock of recognition that followed the name. He could be a man who worked with wood and steel. He could be any man. But the name meant something different. The recognition she felt was not an epiphany of gratitude. It felt more like a bruise coming into color. Whoever he was, he had placed them inside a story without her consent, and the weight of that made her chest hollow. She turned her face away from the screen. Emma, who had been coloring by the sugar caddy, asked in the small-voiced way that children do when they feel the static of adult trouble, "Is that the man who does tricks, Mom?" "He is," Sarah said.
She kept her voice even because she had promised herself not to let rage pool in the kitchen and spill over onto the girl, who was still learning how people behaved when disappointed. "He's someone we know." Days stretched after that into a kind of cold truce. Daniel tried to call and left messages that were apologies without excusing the choice. He wrote a letter to Sarah, badly phrased, sincere, saying he was ashamed and that he would accept whatever she decided. He did not ask her to return. He asked for an opportunity to explain, to be honest without the shield of false modesty. Sarah, for her part, set boundaries like beams. She told him face to face once when he came and sat on the diner bench in winter light and looked as if he were a man stripped of everything he had been trying to be. "No contact for a while. You crossed a line. Let the kids be normal when they're not with either of us. Let me feel like we are not a story for people to parse." She meant it. She wanted to protect her daughter from becoming a footnote in someone else's redemption plot. There was real consequence in that no contact. Owen and Emma missed each other with a bluntness children feel, but adults sanitize. Emma asked where Owen's truck was, and Owen drew a picture of a girl and a boy holding hands that he shoved into the back of his closet. The children did not articulate shame or the adult contours of betrayal. They articulated absence, small, grievous, and honest. Marcus took heat for the part he'd played in not dissuading Daniel sooner. He tried, in the way friends do, to be present without being prescriptive. He called Sarah once to explain parts of Daniel she could not see, the way grief had made him ferociously private, the times he'd chosen to be absent at the cost of loneliness. But he learned quickly that context was not the same as consent. Sarah listened, but she did not ask him to mediate truth for her. She wanted to decide for herself with information and dignity. Victoria's reaction was a different strain. She moved through the social currents with practiced economy, calls to PR, conversations with board members, careful notes placed in the right inboxes. Her concern contained multiple registers, genuine alarm about how the company's image might fracture, and a more personal fear that the man she thought she knew was changing in ways she did not control. She called him, not with the warmth of a friend, but with the calibrated chill of someone who had always measured people's usefulness against a ledger. "Dan," she said on the phone, voice taut as piano wire, "you have to handle this. The board is talking, the press is talking. We need to manage perception." "Perception is not the point," he said. "People were in danger. And your private life is a liability if it bleeds into the business." Her words were blunt, but they were not heartless.
She feared for the livelihoods that sat on projects he controlled. She feared reputations, because she understood how the city's economy spun on them. He heard in her concern the thing he could no longer dismiss, that his personal choices had professional externalities. The board convened. There were careful questions about governance, about oversight at the harbor project, about whether his presence on the site had been a lapse. He faced those questions like someone who thought stability meant taking blame where it belonged and defending what he had done on grounds of moral necessity. At the same time, the social rumor mill had its own cruel economy. There were whispers that Sarah had been picked by the rich man as a charity case. There were insinuations that she had been playing him for access. Those rumors multiplied like rot in the dark, because a story that included money made people greedy with narrative. Sarah felt the heat of them on her skin. It made her posture more defensive than she liked. She also found, in the private hours when she researched his name and read about the foundation, the texture of his life before she had known him. Photographs of Jennifer, smiling, water-splashed, plaques engraved with Thornton in the mouths of lobbies, a list of philanthropic projects. Seeing those artifacts flattened some of her anger into complicated, quieter questions. How had he come to believe the lie was the only way to be known? How had grief become an excuse to experiment with other people's hearts? It would have been easy for the narrative to harden into two camps, him as villain of omission, her as a victim of deception. But the truth refused such economy. There were moments of stubborn tenderness from both sides. Daniel leaving care packages anonymously for Madison's diner staff, Sarah returning an overlarge anonymous donation to the shelter, because she had found that dignity mattered more than the size of help. They both navigated the same moral terrain with different maps. Months moved forward on a restrained calendar. The board called for oversight changes at the harbor project. Daniel agreed to the investigation and publicly released a statement admitting that he had made decisions under some pressure and acknowledging that he had failed to be entirely transparent. It was an ugly, necessary thing for him. Accountability felt like mortar being applied to a crack. He chose publicly to step back from daily oversight, not from his life, but from the role that demanded constant optics. He delegated more to the operations team and insisted that an independent review board be created. That act was not a redemption. It was a structural repair meant to show he would not use power to shield mistake. For Sarah, the structural repair she required was less about public statements and more about private dignity. When a reporter offered her money for an interview, she said no. When Victoria saw an opportunity to control a narrative by offering Sarah financial stability if she would attend a charity evening and say the right thing, Sarah refused the patronizing choreography. "You don't get to buy my silence," she said in a calm voice to Victoria, who had expected compliance more than confrontation. Victoria, in turn, was taken aback. She hadn't expected the woman to be so clear-sighted. It unsettled her in ways that were, finally, human. Victoria's response softened with time, not into contrition, but into the realization that power, like any tool, could be wielded with cruelty or with restraint. There was a point when the two worlds had to meet in a contained, deliberate space. Daniel announced a holiday gala, not the ostentatious fundraisers he had once presided over, but a modest event the foundation hosted to give out grants to small community groups. He asked Sarah, through Marcus, who had been at both ends of their friendship, if she would attend as a guest, and to see in the full light the man behind the headlines. He made no public plea. He offered no bribe. He simply extended the invitation and let the rest be her decision. She nearly said no. Then she thought about Owen clambering onto her lap like he belonged there, about Emma naming the cat in her drawings, Hope, and about the children's quiet questions. She thought about dignity and the chance to see someone who had caused hurt attempt to make amends in the full gaze of other people. She wondered if honesty was something that could be rebuilt in public when the calculus had been set privately. When she arrived at the gala, she wore something that was not for show. It was clothing that felt like armor enough to walk through social currents, but not a costume she would have to shed. The room had candles, speech cards, and a small stage. People milled, donors, board members, a few faces she recognized from the neighborhood. Victoria was there, composed like someone who assumes control by moving air. Marcus sat near the bar with his hands folded as if ready to intervene if anything tipped over. Daniel watched her enter with a mixture of anxiety and resolve that a man cannot bear with a press release. He had rehearsed what he would say for hours, then thrown all of it away until only the simplest truth remained. When he came to the stage, he did not walk with the language of a man defending legacy. He spoke in sentences intended to be understood rather than to blind. He told the room he had been a father who had tried to protect his son and in the process had misjudged the costs of secrecy. He spoke of the harbor project with bluntness about errors and the oversight he had instituted to make sure a similar thing could not happen again. He acknowledged the hurt he had caused Sarah and the community, and he apologized in a way that named harm without expecting absolution.
Then he did something that surprised more people than it should have. He stepped off the stage. He went to Sarah across the room where the music made private conversations necessary, and he said, "I will do the hard work to earn back your trust. I will not hide behind my name. I will not use power to smooth over the consequences. If you are willing to consider steps, here are the ones I propose." He handed her a list, practical changes he had already initiated, a blind trust for philanthropic donations, an independent board to oversee the foundation's projects where he would no longer hold veto power, and a community fund for single parents that would be governed by a panel including neighborhood representatives, not him. Sarah read the list with slow, careful fingers. Some things on it convinced her of his sincerity: the removal of veto power, the inclusion of independent community voices. Money was present as tools and not as trumpets. He had not offered her a sum in a boardroom or a private parachute out of hardship. He had altered the scaffolding that governed influence. He had not circled her life and left a polite signature at the bottom. He had changed the structure. "Why would you do all of this?" she asked quietly, in a corner lit more by people's dignity than by chandeliers. "Because I owe it," he said. "Because I used people's lives as a test and it was wrong. And because Owen deserves a world where his father's name doesn't obscure his tenderness. Because I want to be someone who is accountable." His voice was steady. He had practiced the admission of fault until it came without theatrics. "I will step away from public leadership for now. I will make room for structures that prevent the very harm we saw. And I will do whatever it takes to make sure your name is not a footnote in a story that belongs to you." There was a long silence. In it, Sarah thought of Emma drawing sons without teeth and Owen sleeping with a toy truck. She thought of the way generosity should not be a shaming device, and of how, in the marrow of things, people deserve to be seen for who they were. She also thought of boundaries and of the tender, fragile work of trust. She did not say yes to him in that moment. She said instead, "Start here. Be honest. No secrets. Let the children have normalcy. Work with me, not for me." He agreed. He agreed publicly, and then he followed those words with action. He canceled a number of public appearances and filed paperwork to create the trust he had promised. He made room in the boardroom for community members and engineers unaffiliated with his firm to review projects. He put internal policies in place that formalized transparency. He asked Victoria to sit on an advisory council that would serve without her usual unilateral authority. She accepted with a weariness that hinted at an ache, not a victory.
She had, in the end, wanted a life that wasn't broken by scandal any more than she wanted a life in which the people she cared about were punished by consequence. The concessions were not clean. They were, like any repair, threaded with compromise. Their reconciliation unfolded like the slow setting of mortar. There were practical steps, co-parenting schedules that honored both their needs, mediated conversations about the children's exposure to media, and concrete plans for Sarah's return to nursing school. Daniel offered to fund a tuition account for Sarah, but did so in a way that preserved her agency. He proposed a scholarship through the community fund with anonymous contributions and governance by an independent panel that included Sarah's voice. She accepted, not as a gift to erase past wrongs, but as assistance with a clause. She would not be a public face of the donation. It was a practical compromise that allowed her to move forward without commodifying her recovery. Time, more than grand gestures, healed certain things. There were days when Sarah watched Daniel arrive with flour on his sleeve because he had been making pancakes with Emma and Owen while she finished a night shift. There were mornings when he drove kids to school because she had an early clinical, and evenings when she would sit in on a board meeting, not as a curiosity, but as someone who had learned, painfully, how the world balanced on decisions that were not always visible. Owen learned in the quiet of those months to be bolder with his jokes. Emma kept drawing suns in crayons and eventually added a little painted house with stacked beams to the drawing. Sometimes she would trace the edges of the framed letters on the wall they had not yet mounted, the crayon starry envelope and the midnight confession,
And she would ask, "Is that Santa?" And Daniel would say, "Maybe Santa helps people find one another." And she would accept that kind of answer because it made sense to a child. Victoria and Sarah, over time, formed a wary respect. They met at a coffee shop once, where Victoria brought papers and Sarah brought a quiet skepticism that was not hostile. Victoria admitted she had been frightened of what would happen to the things she had helped build. Sarah admitted she had been frightened of being patronized. They did not become friends, but they shared an understanding of how power demanded ethical use. Victoria, in some private moments, reconsidered her own instincts and perhaps softened in ways that did not make headlines, because growth rarely does. Marcus remained the friend who would bring over lasagna on the nights when exhaustion outpaced both adults. He watched the slow rebuilding with the indulgent eye of someone who had long seen his friend stumble and stand and stumble again. "You did a messy thing," he told Daniel once when they sat on a stoop watching the kids play, "but you chose to fix the actual structure instead of putting lipstick on a problem."
"I could have done better," Daniel said. "I will try to be better." "That's a start," Marcus said. "A good start." 6 months later, their life had the shape of a family that had been assembled carefully and imperfectly. Sarah was back in classes, nursing textbooks stacked like a new kind of furnishing beside the sofa. She worked nights at the clinic and studied during the day, trading off with Daniel on the weekends. He stayed late at a smaller office that had no penthouse glare. He was present at playdates and,